The Business Simplicity Podcast, where leaders share their most successful strategies and the failures that inspired them, so business owners and managers can avoid the suffering and reap the benefits. With your host, Chris Parker.
And welcome back to the Business Simplicity Podcast. This is Chris Parker, and I'm having a conversation with Pepijn Palmans from Dstny, and this is part of the Sustainability Week. So this whole week, we're going to be dropping episodes about sustainability and the sustainability sprint that we ran with Dstny. Before I get into this, this should be being published on the 29th of November, and that means there's one more day in Movember. And if you're watching on the video, I'm growing my mustache, which is to raise awareness and money for men's health. And so I'll put the link to my Movember campaign in the show notes, but maybe more importantly than donating, engaging with people who just might need to know that you care about them, that you love them, that you're there for them could make, all the difference in someone's life. So my invitation during Movember is to reach out to someone that maybe you haven't spoken with for a while, and maybe they just need to hear from someone who cares for them. So go for it. Looping back to Pepijn and sustainability and Dstny. I work with Pepijn in Dstny as a group. And as you would have heard yesterday from Samuel, the CTO of Dstny, they ran a sustainability sprint with a number of people over a number of days. And we're gonna talk to Pepijn about that because he was a participant. And I'm really curious to see how, as he showed up to the first day and had no idea really what to expect, how that went. But before we get into that, Pepijn, can you kick us off with a little bit of just sharing what is it that you yourself do, Pepijn?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I'm actually head of cloud infrastructure in what we call within Dstny the Global Infrastructure Service Company. So we have this entity that serves other entities within the group mainly. As an infrastructure provider, as we believe that as we're all the way across Europe with our business, there's a lot of things we can actually do on a group level. So that's where I'm responsible for all that is cloud infra.
And to give people a sense of scale, because we're operating over multiple countries, when you talk about the scale of cloud infrastructure for Dstny, do you have any indication of the volume you guys are working with?
Yeah, sure. Without just going in full numbers, because I don't think our listeners are interested in me reading Excel files here out loud. You have to know that with all these acquisitions we did, we inherited a lot of data centers. We have countries where we have 10, 15 data centers per country. We have countries where we only have 2 or 3 data centers. But given the amount of countries and the amount of data centers, we're talking about tens of data centers across Europe, with a lot of data, with a lot of redundant data in the end, with a lot of services built by a lot of people with a lot of passion, but all built before acquisition, and that's what we try to gather and to bring together and try to manage.
And one of the topics that came up in our little pre-conversation was wrestling with continuing to scale infrastructure while reducing or managing the environmental impact. And I guess some of the drivers of scaling is obviously acquiring new companies, but there's also organic growth, growth of services, business communication services. So what is on your mind? Like, what is the problem, the quote unquote, the problem you're trying to solve by scaling while managing the impact that you brought with you into these sustainability discussions?
Yeah, maybe first let me talk about challenges rather than problems, because I believe that as a company we're doing well and we're growing fast, and not just by acquisition, like you said. That's really correct what you said there is. But the thing is, with a fast-growing company, you always have the challenge to keep up. And it starts with a business idea, it starts with execution and in the developing of a product, and then that product needs to be brought to the market. And when it is brought to the market by a tech company, it always means it needs to be hosted somewhere. Whether it needs connectivity on the network, whether it needs a server park to sit on to be hosted, The constant challenge is to maintain what we have, to add what we acquired, and at the same time keep up with the pace of business development as well, because we are living in a really fast evolving world here. And it's a fantastic market to be in. I haven't been in this market before I joined Dstny, so it was all new to me when I joined more than a year ago. But the fun thing in this market is that there's so many things evolving, and it really goes at a fast pace. So the biggest challenge here, and again, I dare to say that's a challenge more than a problem, because it's a luxury thing that you can work in a sector where we actually grow day in, day out. So that's finding a balance there. When you bring this back to the sustainability of it, one of the easy ways to do this is, well, let's just throw a lot of money at it. Just buy new servers, buy more data centers, do not do anything on consolidation, and you will end up with a fantastic set of hardware, with a massive overconsumption of energy, with a ginormous footprint in the hardware we buy, because let's be honest, it's not built here around the corner. It needs to be built, it needs materials, it needs to be shipped, it needs to be put in place, it needs to be run. So if you look at that footprint, finding a balance between spending enough in being able to keep up the pace and doing a good thing, while not overspending, because that would be the easy way in just a short term, saying, hey, we just deploy and deploy and deploy more and more and more, and we'll just clean up afterwards. Because that would be nice in the 90s, maybe in the 2000s, where we just threw tons of servers at a data center and we didn't have to look at what the energy cost was. We didn't have to look at what the footprint was. But that is not the way of doing business these days. At least not that's how I believe it should not be the way of doing business.
So can you unpack that a little bit? Because I know you've been busy with this, before we did a sustainability sprint. This is already something on your mind. For any other cloud infrastructure leaders or managers or engineers out there, do you have any, what's a top tip to reduce the impact of scaling infrastructure?
I think it goes hand in hand in how we try to develop GIS as an internal service provider. And with that, I mean is that in the beginning, if you start doing this internal company delivering services within a group, it's easy to say, hey, we just start doing made-to-measure work for everyone. While I strongly believe that if you want to be able to follow the pace, you need to set standards. That goes hand in hand in getting the consumption model under control. Is if you build standards, you can actually reuse and optimize the use of whatever you deploy in a data center. And I think if there's one thing I could really hint to is make standards and standardize on everything. We've done that, for instance, with just deploying only two separate kinds of servers anymore. Not any kind of server for every department. In the end, you make a choice between two models and you make some small adaptations, but you stick to those two models, and that gives you the flexibility of reusing and shifting loads from one to another very easily.
Well, what I love about this, and I champion this when talking about sustainability with people, is it makes such business sense. So if you look at your business, your organization through the lens of sustainability, that one of the first things you need to know is have some data. I mean, what's actually going on there? What is your consumption? And most likely, almost guaranteed, you will discover some crazy stuff going on that maybe otherwise wasn't discovered. And I don't know if there's crazy things going on in Dstny, but I did hear that 40 servers were decommissioned the other day, that just because they were starting to be interrogated, like, do we really need these things? Is this really adding value? And are you aware of the impact of these things? And if you're getting people to think structurally on, do I really need to do this? I think that's already a huge win. So
yeah, and you touch a really nice thing there when you said, are you really aware of this? Because and sorry I interrupted you, but so the thing is that when you talk about data and you need to start getting things under control, one of the first things I did when I was installed as head of cloud infrastructure was make someone responsible for capacity. And initially people looked at me like, hey, well, we're a very technical department. I was like, no, Yes, of course we are. We are engineers. We are developing state-of-the-art solutions. We are doing this in a pan-European network, which is a fantastic thing for technology people to live in. But at the same time, if you want to get things under control, you need to know what you're managing. So I installed this capacity manager, and after more than 3 to 4 weeks, I just got week after week, I got reports, and everything looked like completely red, like, hey, we have an issue over there, we have an issue over there. What we saw is that by starting to right-size things and to actually drive things together, and by talking to what I dare to call our internal customers of all the departments and countries we're serving, is that you can only raise their awareness if you can give them insights. And if you don't have those insights yourself, how can you make those decisions in how can you drive your business if you don't know that yourself? But one of the things I really believe in is don't just make them for your own department. Whatever you create as insights for yourself, share them immediately outside to the group. And then it makes sense for them as well to start thinking. Because I remember this one case where we developed a new product and it needed to be launched, and everyone was involved in so many different departments. And all of a sudden, we saw an enormous increase in consumption of some of our server parks. And when we sat down with those people actually consuming all these services, it made sense from their perspective on how their consumption model was based and in how they, in my opinion, overscaled a bit on that moment. But they never saw the other side. So when we showed them their numbers and showed them the impact and say, hey, this is not just an impact on capacity, this is also an impact on cost level, there's also an impact on this. Then we're like, yes, but if we don't do it now, how can we make sure that we can actually get it afterwards? And that's where we came back, say, hey, that's my capacity management. Now I need to make sure that I know what your demand will be, what your growth will be. And again, bringing this all back to standards, it helps you to actually downsize the overall, limit the overhead, and start right-sizing and be able to scale for everyone at the same time instead of just each project in a silo and doing it that way.
I guess making it so easy. So if someone uses a hyperscaler like Azure, AWS or something, just drop your credit card in and they're more than happy to sell you infinite capacity. And that can be troublesome because it's back in the day when you had to, install actual servers and storage and pizza boxes and by pizza boxes, sorry, well, not for you, but for people who are farther away from this, pizza box is like a pizza box shaped server you slide into a rack. It required a physical action. You had to buy it, you had to order it, had to receive it, and that friction in itself, I think, created some awareness. And now it's just so easy. So looping back to, so I guess one of the things is be aware, measure and be aware. I think that helps anyways. Coming into the sustainability sprint, you are part of the management team, but one of the participants from GIS, Global Infrastructure Services, that joined these 5 half days. I'd love to just sit back for a while and Pepijn, share, I don't know, maybe why did you go and what did you experience and what came out of it? Just tell the story of what happened to you over those 5 days.
Yeah. Maybe the first thing we need to answer is why did we do this at GIS? That's a question I receive a lot from people, like, okay, but why GIS? Why not Dstny as a whole? Why not as a group? Why not as a country? Why not as because we are one group, and at the same time we're still building the one big company we just acquired another company. We constantly add people to the group. And then I also dare to say then, why not? That would be my first reply. Why not GIS? I think the footprint we have as an organization with Global Infra is so big with the data centers we run, with all the energy we consume, that it was just easy for us to say, hey, we've got a lot of people who actually care about our planet, who actually care about the footprint we have, who care about the company as well, because those go hand in hand. I mean, we can easily greenwash everything and say, hey, we're just going to lower our energy consumption and we're just going to buy off, plant some trees and so on, but that's not what we want to do. So the first thing is, when we rolled into this project was, okay, but we as GIS, how shall we do this? And it's so fun to see that we just stepped into the project, and then went back to the other organization, hey guys, by the way, we're doing this. And all the country managers were like, yeah, I love it. And since we had people from all Europe involved, they were just like, hey, bring this to us. Like, how can we participate? How can we start adding to this? So that's the really first thing I want to say. Next to that, if you look at the process we went through, it's funny to see how you bring a bunch of people together who have a complete different point of view on what sustainability is. And I think we spent at least half a day with the team in defining, okay, what do we call sustainability? Because I'm talking a lot about energy consumption because it makes sense from my point of view. I'm a huge consumer of energy in our data centers, so that's a really big point with us. But it's not just about energy; it's also about well-being. It's about sustainability towards your employees in keeping them and making sure that their work-life balance makes sense. It's about how do you deal with the offices. It's about how do you deal with everything that has an impact. And sustainability is not just energy. It's not just ecology. For me, it's an end-to-end circle. It's a circular movement where, yes, ecology happens to be a real big part of it, but it also has to do with how do we live as people? How do we stay happy? Because happiness will help you to sustain as a person. If a happy person comes to work, it will actually help to give you a sustainable business. So that circular movement is really something we defined in the first half day, I guess. And out of that, if you then start to look with a broader view on sustainability, okay, how can we as a company work on that? And then two things came to mind, which I think somewhere in the end were written down on paper. One of them was, change never comes too soon. Because in the end, if you ask me, how did you roll into this? It's because just someone stood up and said, like, hey guys, should we not do this? Because it really makes sense that we start doing it. Another one is also that the change is never too small. I mean, we all know the idea of just throwing a stone in the water and the water will never run the same way and things like that. But that also makes sense if you look at sustainability. You don't have to wait, and I think that was the outcome of one of the second or the third session, that it's not because you can't do everything at the same time that you should not start already doing something. And that drove us towards the final sessions where we start defining some goals for ourselves, saying, hey, why not say that before the end of this year, and that was really a clear goal, like before the end of 2022, we want to know how in Q1 we will be measuring our consumption. To actually putting some numbers on it, hey, we want to lower consumption by the end of 2023 by X%. And we actually really clearly written those goals. They're not set in stone, they're put on paper. They might shift a little bit, but they give us a goal to work towards. I think with the help of the people of Cuba as well, by the way, in having the framework, they helped us to get those 10, 15 people with all different opinions into one direction. And we actually got out of it as a group. And yeah, that was really nice to do.
Well, one of one thing before I ask the next question, the sustainability framework, which was developed by a number of people, including Cuba and myself and some other consultants, and people can learn about that at QHUBA.com. I'll put that in the show notes. But we took the simple business design framework that my own consultancy has crafted over the years, and it was used by Cuba in a number of cases. And the question of like, well, can we apply this to sustainability? And so it was more advanced than this, but basically we took the SDGs, the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, which I think there are 17, and we mapped that against the simple business design tool and crafted it, and also looked at a couple other ESG tools and things like that, and tried to make it like as holistic as possible. But just as you said, when a group of people come together to talk about sustainability, like, what do you mean by that? Is this circularity? Is this human well-being sustainability? Is this carbon footprint, issues, what is the thing that you're talking about? And also what sort of scope is it? Are you looking at, I think they call it scope 1, which is the stuff that you can do yourself. And I think scope 2 is more your ecosystem, so around your customers and suppliers and upstream and downstream. And then the scope 3 is rest of world. And so orienting on what is it you're talking about is super helpful. So one of the questions that I'm always fascinated about is because you can do this paperwork, and of course the sprint was much more than that. It was dialogue, and people had to write things down and discuss things, and and at the end present it to some executives, which was awesome and intense. But how can an organization, or how is GIS ensuring that the value of this will be achieved? So like you already mentioned, having some clear goals, but there was already, Samuel would have been listened to yesterday as CTO. He is himself, very sustainable person. There was already work going on, and then you did the sprint and crafted that a bit tighter, and you have a bit tighter of an ambition, and it's been activated. How can you ensure that the value of this will actually be realized over time?
Well, there's two ways to answer this, and the one is really the political correct way in saying, well, you set the goals, you put some deadlines to it, you put a project manager or whatever, sustainability manager on top of that, and you go with that. In a way, that is what we're doing on one end. I'll get to the other option later in my answer. But by really making measurable, that still is something internal. You have to externalize things, because I strongly believe that it's like we're getting near the end of the year, and you know that a lot of people will say at the last day of the year, as of tomorrow, I will quit XYZ. And we're all people. If you just tell yourself, as of tomorrow, I'm gonna stop XYZ. You don't tell anyone. Who's there to control you? So what we did is, the first thing we did is, even in the same week, we went to a lot of people inside the board, the country management people, and said, like, hey, before this and the end of the year, you all have quarterly meetings. Can we get 5 minutes on each of your quarterly meetings, and we'll stand in front of the audience, which basically means 80% of the entire group of company, if you can add up everyone who's attending those meetings in all these different countries. And we just stood there and say, hey guys, these are the goals. And by the way, next quarterly meeting, we'll be back with an update on that. And that brings me back to how you say, hey, if you just take a decision for yourself, yeah, I'm going to quit smoking. Yeah, fantastic thing to do for a lot of people. And say, hey, like, if on January 6th, you pick up your first cigarette and nobody knew you were actually quitting, who's there to judge you? So externalize your goals and make them measurable, and trick people into actually asking questions. I mean, if you make it interesting for them, they will actually come back to us and say, hey, where are you on this process? And that will keep you going. So that's a political correct answer with a bit of a way of by externalizing this in getting some more assurance that the goals will be met. The second thing I think is really interesting and really related to the time we're living in is the pressure of the financials on this. If you just look at the financial gain we can have these days, I don't have to tell anyone about gas and electricity prices. Just think on the hundreds of kilowatts of power we're using in all these data centers. You can imagine what that does on a financial load on our shoulders. So it makes sense to do it, and it really makes sense to do it now. And if not for the right reasons, we'll do it for the financial reasons anyway. So that is a huge driver that will make us do at least a huge part of it.
Well, that's kind of what I was alluding to. Great points. Externalizing it, meaning creating a space for people to hold you accountable. And also, it just makes so much sense. If you look at your business with discipline through different lenses, and if an organization's not structurally doing hardcore sustainability. Maybe it's a newer lens, or maybe there's a different dimension. Maybe you're already, people are already, mastering their carbon neutrality, and now they want to come in with a well-being lens. And then this always makes sense, because it's just you're looking at your business through a different lens, and you will learn about waste and things that are going wrong. So it's challenges. You'll discover more challenges.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
and it was, by the way, also nice because you're talking about these different views and these external lenses. It's really nice that during those workshops, we actually had, I think, 4 or 5 external people coming to talk to us about how they dealt with it. Whether it was coming from a supplier, whether it was coming just from an industry perspective. It was really interesting to see an external view, because that, again, sheds a different light on how we should deal with these things.
What were some highlights from those external speakers, if you remember?
I think the 2 that come to mind is one of them was the owner of one of our data centers in Belgium, who said, well, we just went through an enormous cycle of measurement and gathering data and visualizing data. And what he said that stuck to me as well as to a lot of people is that at a certain moment, he's like, hey, you think it's all about energy, but then we get a hint that we're actually impacting our footprint enormously by the gas losses we have on all our piping system for the cooling systems. Was something that was really struck, and it struck them as well, because it came out of the report when they went through the scope 1, scope 2 cycles. So that's one thing. On the other hand, we had a hardware vendor who was answering a lot of questions of what we had about if you ever want to get into scope 3, which is the indirect, like whatever your suppliers are doing indirectly, how can we net zero or neutralize those? We said like, hey, well, we will be out of business in 5 years if we don't get to do that, and if we don't get insight. So we had a lot of talk on how will they visualize that towards us, so we can actually get that into account. So I think these points were really nice to see.
The structure of the 5 days is really start going very wide, and then in the middle sort of have a very structured brainstorm session, and by the end converge it down to a very concise series of statements that are presented to an executive team. And in this case, we had the group CEO, CFO, and the sustainability officer from the private equity shareholder. That was great. And each day we have a type of guest speaker. So either like an inspirational or educational. We like to have a supplier. We like to have someone with the voice of the customer there, and to give all these different perspectives and lenses through the whole thing. It's I think it really enriches it. So it keeps people from going into what they would maybe just naturally have already thought. So if you hear about how someone else did it, and then you have to reflect, okay, well, what are we doing, and what should we be busy with? It just gets the brain moving differently. It's and plus it's a lot of fun. So one quick thing maybe before we start to wrap up, Pepijn, after the sustainability sprint, there were questions around the basic business design of GIS, and one of the consultants, Wim Luberson, continued on that and went out of sustainability and back into basically simple business design work, which is the origin of the framework, in order to think about okay, well, how does this business called GIS, how is it formed, and how does it work? What are some highlights for that? Like, why did you as managers continue that conversation? What came up during the sprint that made you feel compelled to continue the dialogue and further clarify things?
I think it relates a lot to what we said in the beginning of this podcast. Is what we're doing, and you called it a problem, I called it a challenge, is coping with the growth of and the pace of what we're doing. And I think that it's natural for a bunch of managers to, on one end, dig in deep and just jump into it together with their teams and really make things happen. But then again, you also have to sometimes step out of it and say, hey, let's look at the horizon and see where this big tanker is going to. Because if we don't steer enough now, we will not be able to actually get where we need to go without making really some bigger turns later on. So that gave us the opportunity to say, hey, where are we now? And how can we just take one step back and look at where we are now, and at the same time look at where we need to be in 1-2 years maybe, and start working on that. Because if you don't do that today, you will not get there in 1 or 2 years. In 1 or 2 years, you will find yourself lost and have to start redoing everything else over and over again. So that's why we did it. And if there's anything that came out of it, is again the fun in getting different perspectives. Because I could ask you, you could ask me, and say, hey, you have this division, you have this company, give me a basic structure, and then we'll just open the library, create some slides, we'll start doing something, and then you get to a perfect structure on paper. But it's by interviewing people, it's by talking to people, it's by getting different perspectives on this, by getting questions you maybe not would have ever asked yourself, but just get an external person in. He might ask a different question, say, hey, okay, that brings us to a discussion where we, by the current management team ourselves, maybe would not have been going to.
Yeah, when Samuel was explaining this on again, the podcast that people can listen to yesterday, going on the 28th of November, he really liked having the first 2 days of sprint work from like all 15 people, because there's such a rich diversity of thought and opinion and idea that if you sort of trolled through all that, you could find a lot of innovation, even that, and also where people are agreeing and disagreeing, and these are things that that you could wrestle with as a management team and on looking forward. And for me, this is another gift of, if you look at your business from the lens of sustainability, if you do it with engagement and dialogue, you will find other opportunities to create alignment and clarity. And this is, I thought it was just delightful with what you guys did. So,
can I just comment one more thing on that, Chris?
Yeah.
Maybe we didn't emphasize this during the podcast yet, but what I really liked about it is it was not just a management team doing it. We had developers, network engineers, people from across Europe. We had management people in it as well. We had people with all different profiles. And also that, by just getting around the same table, dropping all titles, everything, because even in Dstny, we're not so big on titles anyway, but like everyone was equal, but with a so different background. And that really brought a lot of perspective to things as well. Yeah, and that's something we should do more in any kind of restructuring, involving everyone in it, because
absolutely. And this is something that we try to inspire with organizations doing the sprint, but I think it was just it's naturally part of the DNA of Dstny to be, I guess, inclusive like that. It was really nice to see. So, Pepijn, before we wrap up, checking in. I don't think you've asked me a question yet, have you? I'm curious. Is there anything on your mind that you'd like to fire back before we wrap up?
What I usually like to ask everyone who's asking me about sustainability is, given your perspective and you're involved with Dstny as a company as well, what do you think we should pay more attention to?
Knowing Dstny and knowing the two co-founders who are innately sustainable thinking and living in their own way. So Samuel being more in the environmental space, but also a very human guy, and Dan, the CEO, being really humanly, authentically interested in human vitality, well-being. Are we building a great company as well as a great product? That already is a huge gift, meaning the fact that leadership is there, and even more analytical, like the CFO, when we were doing the executive session, the fact that he was super supportive, and the fact that the shareholder was there, and they have their sustainability officer and their ambition, and they were super supportive. That takes away all the excuses of we can't do stuff. So I think Dstny is already a huge step forward, because it's a natural part of the organization. What is missing maybe not completely missing, but missing in a structured, actionable way is data and information. And so this is also what you guys put on your roadmap to improve that. Who is consuming what? What is the impact of that? What can you actually influence? And sometimes the influence isn't so much what you do yourself, but maybe, how can you exert pressure on your suppliers? And that's a way of affecting change. How do you include sustainability of a broad dimension, the definition of sustainability into RFPs? Like if you're out buying stuff, do you with that hardware vendor that presented, it's one of our strategic vendors, they have their circularity program that we can give, hardware back to them if we want, and they will make sure it's, that's incredible. Let's make sure we do that. I believe Dstny's already in I think it's called Close the Gap. It's a, for desktop computing, those, in the past when I was closer to Close the Gap, laptops and computers can be shipped to Africa for schools and things. And more importantly, once they're end of life, they come back, and they have to be dealt with. So you're not creating this whole e-waste nightmare in Africa, and you're actually just pushing our problem over there thinking we're doing good. There's this whole circularity built into that, which I think is brilliant. So the thing that I would really celebrate is getting more holistic structural awareness based on data, so then people can be more aware when they're making the decisions. I would recommend that to anyone.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. You'll be happy to hear that I had a meeting last week with a company who's specializing in visualizing consumption data. And it was so fun to see how they build databases out of publicly available information on the non-operational part of consumption. So you could literally say, hey, I'm going to buy a server, whether it's IBM, HP, Dell, Cisco. It's that model. I'm going to depreciate, or I'm going to keep it in operation for X amount of time. And they'll just automatically start calculating back, hey, well, that will be your footprint on the non-operational part. And then they wrote plugins to constantly measure the consumption of these kind of things and bring that to life, and even bring that all the way up to the level of an application, where you could actually say, well, this specific virtual machine which belongs to that application is actually responsible for the footprint of X. So yeah, we're looking into that.
I'd love it if it was taking the next step and how we're developing the software to optimize the consumption, just to because you can develop things that are maybe a bit lazy and are running at a peak always, or there are things that, hey, you could, if you only need this application, every Tuesday afternoon,
then only spin it up at Tuesday afternoon.
And so to only spin it up at Tuesday afternoon and architect it for that. Lovely. So Pepijn Palmans, thank you so much. Whenever we engage at Dstny, it's always great. And this was a lovely sample of that. Thank you for being on the podcast. Dstny, dstny.com. The link will be in the show notes. I'll put the link to Pepijn's LinkedIn page as well, if you ever want to find him. The link to Cuba, QHUBA, the consulting partner that did the sustainability sprint. And the sprint was based on the Simple Business Design Canvas from Ebullient, my little side agency. And you can download the toolkit on simplicity, and there's a chapter in there on the sustainability. You can download that ebook for free at ebullient.com. You can find that where you find the show notes. So, Pepijn, thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you for listening. Download the Simplicity Toolkit from ebullient.com to discover the power of the Simplicity Scan and Sprint. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite player.